Montgomery, Alabama, December 1st, 1955. A soft-spoken seamstress climbs onto a public bus after a long day bent over an ironing board. Her feet ache, her shoulders are sore, and when the driver orders her to give up her seat, she utters a single word that ignites one of the most important civil rights protests of the 20th century. The word is no. The obituaries would call her timid and shy. A young engineer sits alone in a cubicle at 6:30 in the morning, drinking instant coffee, sketching the blueprint for the personal computer. His advice to young inventors: work alone, not on a team, not on a committee. A first lady so anxious in crowds she'd leave parties early reshapes the conscience of an entire nation. Everything our culture teaches us about who gets to be great, who leads, who creates, who changes the world, might be exactly backwards. Here's something most people don't know. 1 out of every 2 or 3 people you know is an introvert. Your best friend, your sister, the colleague you sit next to every day, maybe even you. And almost none of them say it out loud, because somewhere along the way, and I'll show you exactly where, our culture decided that being quiet was a problem, that if you'd rather read a book than work a room, something was wrong with you, that if you needed to be alone to think, you weren't a team player, that if you spoke softly, you couldn't lead. We built a world that runs on volume. And then we wondered why so many of the people inside it feel like they don't fit. But here's what almost nobody tells you. Some of the most important ideas in human history, the theory of gravity, the theory of relativity, Google, the personal computer, Charlie Brown, Harry Potter, came from people who spend more time inside their own heads than outside them. I want to tell you about a young Wall Street lawyer. Let's call her Laura. Harvard law graduate, brilliant analytical mind, soft-spoken to her core. She'd thrown up on the way to class more than once because the Socratic-style debates terrified her. Now she was sitting at a negotiation table with a room full of pounding-the-table bankers, and her quiet thoughts were running on a loop. I'm too quiet for this, too unassuming, too cerebral. I should look for another career. Then she did something almost no one in that room expected. She started asking questions, soft, careful, devastating questions. What are your numbers based on? What if we structured it this way? What if we tried a different approach? She never raised her voice. She never pounded the table. By the end of the meeting, the opposing lawyer had offered her a job. The opposing banker had offered her his entire company's legal business, and not one person in that room had had to shout. What Laura discovered that day is what the next hour is about. Over the next 55 minutes, I'll walk you through every key idea from one of the most important books ever written about personality. We'll talk about what introversion actually is and what it isn't, how our culture became so obsessed with the opposite, why the loudest voices in the room ended up wrong about almost everything that matters, and what to do about all of it if you've ever wondered why being quiet in a noisy world feels so exhausting. So let's start at the beginning, with the moment America fell in love with loud. Section 1. How America fell in love with loud. Picture a young boy in 1902. His name is Dale, and he lives on a pig farm in a dot on the map called Harmony Church, Missouri. He's skinny, he's not athletic, he's afraid of thunder, afraid of lightning, afraid of going to hell, and most of all, afraid of being tongue-tied at the worst possible moments. He worries about his wedding day. What if, when the moment comes, he can't think of a single thing to say to his bride? His parents are honest, religious, poor. They want him to be a teacher or a preacher. They don't dream of much more than that. But then, one day, a speaker comes to town. In those days, there was a movement called the Chautauqua, sending gifted speakers out to rural America to lecture on literature, science, religion. For farm kids like Dale, these speakers were the only window into the wider world, and this particular one had a story that captured him completely. The speaker had been a farm boy too, a nobody, and then he developed a charismatic speaking style, and suddenly he was on a stage, People listened to him. He was somebody. Dale never forgot it. A few years later, off at college, Dale notices something. The boys who win the speaking contests on campus, they're the ones everyone treats like leaders. So he enters every contest he can find. He runs home at night and practices, and he loses. Again and again and again. Dale is dogged, but the truth is, he's not much of an orator. Not yet. Eventually though, it pays off. He transforms himself into a speaking champion. Other students start coming to him for lessons. He coaches them. They win too. By 1908, he leaves college, gets a job selling beef on the road, hates it, quits, and in a small classroom at a YMCA night school on 125th Street in New York City, he teaches his very first public speaking class. The wise director almost didn't let him. Didn't think there'd be enough interest to justify even the standard night school pay. He was wrong. The class was an overnight sensation. The boy's name, by the way, well, you probably know it. By the time he was done, he dropped one letter from the family name to evoke a famous industrialist. He went on to found the Dale Carnegie Institute and write one of the most influential self-help books in the history of the English language. Now, you might think this is just a feel-good story. Quiet farm boy overcomes his shyness, discovers his voice, builds an empire teaching others to do the same. The American dream. But something deeper was happening. Something almost no one noticed at the time. Before Dale Carnegie, when Americans wrote books about how to be a good person, they used a particular word over and over again. That word was character. Character meant being honest, being disciplined, being moral, being the kind of person who did the right thing whether anyone was watching or not. After Dale Carnegie, the word changed. The word became personality, and personality meant something completely different. Personality meant being magnetic, charismatic, fascinating, stunning, dominant, energetic. The new self-help books had chapters with titles like How to Make People Like You Instantly. Carnegie himself wrote one called And This Part Is Real, Making People Glad to Do What You Want. Think about that shift for a moment. We went from a culture that asked, "Who are you?" deep down when no one is looking, to a culture that asks, "How do you come across to other people in a 30-second elevator ride?" We didn't just gain something, we gave something up. And once you see this shift, you start seeing it everywhere. In advertising, in the rise of mass media, in the way we hire, the way we date, the way we vote. We started believing that the way someone seems is more important than who they actually are. Fast forward about 100 years to a convention center in Atlanta, Georgia. A former Wall Street lawyer named Susan Cain has paid $895 to attend a seminar. The seminar promises to teach her to be more energetic, more powerful, more alive. As she hands in her registration form, a woman named Stacy greets her with what can only be described as a honeyed scream. "Are you excited?" Across the lobby, Susan can hear shrieking. Stacy explains, beaming, that those are people getting pumped up to go inside. For the next 4 days, 15 hours a day, Susan will be in that room, 8 in the morning until 11 at night. With one short break in the afternoon, the teacher will be on stage the entire time. The teacher's name is Tony Robbins. You may have heard of him. Inside the auditorium, dancers in white button-down shirts are warming up the crowd to the Billy Idol song Moni Moni. They move in choreographed sync. The audience is encouraged to climb onto their metal folding chairs and dance along. People are jumping, whooping, clapping. The lead performer wears a tie and the ecstatic, eager smile of a man who has never had a single doubt in his entire life. And Susan stands there with her arms crossed, watching it all, and a question starts to take shape in her mind. What does this seminar promise? That you can become a happier, more successful person. How does it promise to deliver that? By making you more like the dancing man with the perfect tie. By making you louder, bolder, more expressive, more extroverted. The $11 billion American self-help industry is almost by definition a portrait of the self we wish we were. And the self we wish we were, more often than not, is an extrovert. But here's the question that haunts everything we're about to talk about. What if that ideal is wrong? What if the people we're all trying to become, the magnetic, the dominant, the always on, aren't actually the ones who built civilization? What if we've been measuring greatness with a broken ruler this entire time? Susan goes from that Tony Robbins seminar to Harvard Business School, where she watches case method classes that reward the fastest, loudest answer in the room over the most considered one. She visits one of the country's largest evangelical megachurches, where the worship style explicitly rewards public emotional expression, and where one quieter pastor confesses, off the record, that he sometimes wonders if his own contemplative faith is somehow less real than that of the people around him. Everywhere she looks, the same pattern. Speak more, speak faster, speak louder, be more sociable, more visible, more turned on. And if you can't, if you'd rather think before you speak, if you need to be alone sometimes, if your idea of a great Friday night involves a book, well then maybe you should attend a 4-day seminar to fix that. There's a name for what's happening here. It's called the extrovert ideal, the unspoken belief that the ideal self is gregarious, alpha, comfortable in the spotlight, that the kind of person who launches a sentence before they've finished thinking it is somehow more impressive than the one who's still deciding whether that sentence is even true. We're told that to be great is to be bold, to be happy is to be sociable, and 1/3 to 1/2 of the people you know, your best friend, your sister, maybe you, are quietly trying to fit into a world that wasn't built for them. Want some evidence of how deep this goes? Researchers have shown over and over again that talkative people are rated as smarter, better looking, more interesting, and more desirable as friends. That fast talkers are rated as more competent and more likable than slow ones. That in group settings, the people who speak the most are perceived as the smartest in the room, even when there's zero correlation between how much someone talks and how good their ideas actually are. Let that sink in. Zero correlation. We're walking around making major decisions, who to hire, who to promote, who to follow, who to trust, based on a signal that when you actually study it, turns out to be meaningless. One psychologist ran an informal study where she asked introverts to describe their own physical appearance. They used vivid, specific words: green-blue eyes, high cheekbones, exotic. But when she asked them to describe a generic introvert, someone they didn't know, the words changed completely. Ungainly, neutral colors, skin problems. We don't even see ourselves clearly. The extrovert ideal has crawled inside our heads and rewritten the dictionary, and we make ourselves smaller because of it. We feel guilty for skipping the dinner party. We pretend at the office. We come home from the networking event physically exhausted and wonder if there's something wrong with us. We apologize for our children when they hide behind our legs at the playground. We use phrases like, "come out of your shell," as if the shell weren't a perfectly natural part of the animal carrying it. Here's the truth. There is nothing wrong with the shell. There is nothing wrong with the silence. There is nothing wrong with you, but there is something deeply wrong with the world that told you there was. And some of the most important inventions of the past century, the ones that have shaped how you live, how you work, how you communicate, how you think, were created by people who did the exact opposite of what those Tony Robbins seminars teach. They worked alone, in silence, in rooms with the door closed. And what they discovered is that creativity itself has a secret most of us never get told. Section 2. When collaboration kills creativity. March 5th, 1975. A cold, drizzly evening in Menlo Park, California. About 30 engineers are crammed into the garage of an unemployed friend named Gordon French. They call themselves the Homebrew Computer Club. This is their very first meeting. Their mission, if you can call it that, is to make computers accessible to ordinary people. At a time when most computers are temperamental, refrigerator-sized machines that only universities and corporations can afford, this sounds a little like trying to make spaceships accessible to ordinary people. In walks a quiet, bespectacled young man of 24. Shoulder-length hair, a brown beard. He's a calculator designer at Hewlett-Packard. He takes a chair near the back of the garage and listens. He doesn't introduce himself. He doesn't pitch any ideas. He doesn't even really talk to anybody. He's too shy for that. But he listens, intently, as the others marvel over something called the Altair 8800, a clunky build-it-yourself computer that recently made the cover of Popular Electronics. His name is Stephen Wozniak, and as he listens that night, something inside him catches fire. He's been obsessed with electronics since he was 3 years old. When he was 11, he came across a magazine article about a machine called ENIAC, the electronic numerical integrator and computer, and ever since, his dream, and he literally thinks of it with capital letters, the dream, has been to build a machine so small and so easy to use that you could keep it in your home and inside that drafty garage on a rainy Wednesday night. He realizes, maybe, just maybe, the dream is possible. So now here's the question. What did Steve Wozniak do next? If you've absorbed the message of the modern workplace, you probably think you know the answer. You'd say he formed a team, got together with the other homebrew engineers, found a collaborative workspace where ideas could cross-pollinate, maybe rented a co-working space, started having regular sync meetings. He did none of those things. Wozniak went home. Then every morning for months, he got to his cubicle at Hewlett-Packard at 6:30 in the morning, alone. He'd read engineering magazines. He'd studied chip manuals. He designed circuits in his head while the rest of the world slept. After work, he'd go home, eat a quick spaghetti dinner or a frozen TV dinner, then drive back to the office and work late into the night. He later described this period, these quiet midnights, these solitary sunrises, as, quote, the biggest high ever. On the night of June 29th, 1975, at around 10 o'clock at night, he finished building the prototype. He hit a few keys on the keyboard, and letters appeared on the screen. The first time in human history that anyone had typed on a keyboard and watched their words appear in real time on a personal computer screen. He was alone in the room when it happened, and it wasn't an accident that he was alone. It was the whole point. Later, when Wozniak wrote his memoir, he included a passage of advice for young people who dream of inventing something that matters. I want to read part of it to you, because I don't think we hear messages like this often enough. He wrote, "Most inventors and engineers I've met are like me. They're shy and they live in their heads. They're almost like artists. In fact, the very best of them are artists. And artists work best alone, where they can control an invention's design without a lot of other people designing it for marketing or some other committee. I don't believe anything really revolutionary has been invented by committee. If you're that rare engineer who's an inventor and also an artist, I'm going to give you some advice that might be hard to take. That advice is, work alone. Work alone." Now stop and think about what that means for a moment. The man who, more than almost anyone else alive, is responsible for the device you probably have within arm's reach right now. That man is telling young inventors that the single most important thing they can do is be alone, and we have built a world that makes that almost impossible. In the 1970s, the average American office worker had about 500 square feet of personal space. Today, that number is closer to 200. Over 70% of workers now sit in open-plan offices. No walls, no doors, no privacy, just one long humming room where everyone can see everyone else. Companies redesigned their offices this way because they believed it would spark collaboration, ignite creativity, make people happier. It hasn't. Studies of open-plan offices have found that workers in them experience higher levels of stress, more interpersonal conflict, more sick days, and crucially, lower productivity. They have more trouble concentrating, they report more dissatisfaction with their jobs, and ironically, they're worse at the very thing the open plan was supposed to encourage. They share fewer meaningful ideas with their colleagues, not more. Why? Because when you can hear every conversation, you protect yourself by not having any. We didn't just rearrange the furniture. We rearranged the conditions under which deep thought is even possible. And it's not just offices. Walk into a 4th grade classroom today, and you'll often find something that didn't exist a generation ago. The desks are no longer in rows facing the teacher. They're pushed together into pods of 4 or 5, the kids facing each other. The teacher is more of a facilitator than a lecturer. Every assignment, from math to creative writing, is structured as group work. One classroom Susan Cain visited had a sign on the wall. It read, and I'm quoting here, "You can't ask a teacher for help unless everyone in your group has the same question." Think about what that sign is teaching a quiet, thoughtful 9-year-old. It's teaching her that her own questions don't matter, that she can't be curious unless 6 other kids happen to be curious at the same time, in the same way, about the same thing. We've turned childhood into a permanent committee meeting. So is there actually any evidence that all this togetherness produces better ideas? You'd think there must be. We've reorganized our offices and our schools and our entire working lives around this assumption. Surely it's based on something. It isn't. In 1963, a researcher at the University of Minnesota named Marvin Dunnett ran a now famous experiment. He took advertising executives and research scientists at the 3M company. He gave them brainstorming problems. Then he had half of them brainstorm in groups and half of them brainstorm alone with the same problems, the same time limits, the same instructions. Want to guess which group produced more ideas, better ideas, more creative ideas? The individuals working alone produced more ideas than the groups. Their ideas were of higher quality, and the bigger the group got, the worse the performance got. This experiment has been replicated dozens of times in dozens of variations. The result is almost always the same, with one strange exception: electronic brainstorming, where people share ideas through a screen rather than face-to-face. That actually does work. The bigger the group, the better the output. Why the difference? Why does talking out loud in a room make groups dumber, but typing in silence make them smarter? Researchers point to 3 reasons. The first is something called social loafing. When you know others are working on the same problem, you put in less effort yourself. The second is production blocking. Only one person can talk at a time. So while one person is speaking, 3 other people are forgetting the ideas they were about to share. And the third, and this one really matters, is evaluation apprehension. The fear of looking stupid in front of your peers, the instinct to censor your own half-formed thought before it ever reaches your mouth. And the great irony of the modern workplace is that we've built an entire system optimized to crush exactly the conditions under which the best ideas actually appear. Now I want to tell you about a series of studies that ran from 1956 to 1962 at the University of California, Berkeley. The researchers wanted to figure out what made truly creative people different from everyone else. So they assembled a list of architects, mathematicians, scientists, engineers, and writers who had made major contributions to their fields. They invited them to Berkeley for a weekend of personality tests and problem-solving experiments. And then they did the same thing with a second group, people in the same professions who were competent but not groundbreaking. What was the difference between them? The most creative people, the ones who had actually changed their fields, tended to be what the researchers called socially poised introverts. They had good social skills. They could navigate a dinner party. They weren't hermits, but they were, in the language of the study, not of an especially sociable or participative temperament. Many had been shy and solitary as teenagers. They described themselves as independent, individualistic, comfortable being alone for long stretches. Now, this doesn't mean every introvert is a creative genius. Far from it. But it does suggest that when you assemble a group of people who have done extraordinary creative work, you find a lot of quiet people in the group. And the reason, the simple, biological, undeniable reason, is that creative work tends to require long, uninterrupted stretches of concentration, the kind of concentration that's almost impossible when someone keeps poking their head over the wall of your cubicle to ask if you saw that thing on the news. As one psychologist put it, if you're in the backyard sitting under a tree while everyone else is clinking glasses on the patio, you're more likely to have an apple fall on your head. Isaac Newton, by the way, also an introvert. So if solitude is so important to creativity, why have we organized so much of modern life around the opposite? Why do we treat the open office and the group brainstorm and the pod-based classroom as obvious improvements when the evidence says they're not? Part of the answer is that we like the way collaboration feels. It feels productive. It feels democratic. It feels modern. When you walk through an office full of people clustered around whiteboards, your gut tells you that something important is happening, and sometimes it is. But sometimes, often actually, what's really happening is a kind of theater, the performance of work rather than the work itself. And here's where it gets really interesting, because there's a name for the cultural blind spot that's driving all of this. Susan Cain calls it the new groupthink, the unexamined belief that creativity and intellectual achievement must come from a gregarious place, that none of us is as smart as all of us, that the only way to be productive is together, in real time, in the same room. It's a comforting belief. It's also wrong. And the people paying the price for it are the quiet ones, the ones who, given the chance to close a door and think alone, would produce the very ideas the company hired them to produce. Instead, they sit in open-plan offices wearing noise-canceling headphones, trying to pretend they don't exist. Steve Wozniak, sitting alone in his Hewlett-Packard cubicle at 6:30 in the morning, would not have been able to invent the personal computer in a modern open-plan office. And the question we should be asking, the question almost no one is asking, is how many Wozniaks are sitting in those offices right now, wearing the headphones, swallowing their best ideas, waiting for permission to be quiet. But that brings us to a deeper question. Why are some people drawn to solitude in the first place? Why do some of us need it, while others would rather chew tinfoil than spend an evening alone with their thoughts? Is this something we choose, something we learn, or is it something written into us, much earlier and much deeper than we realize? The answer is going to surprise you, because it starts before we can even talk. Section 3. Born This Way. The Biology of Quiet, 1989. Harvard University, Laboratory for Child Development. A psychologist named Jerome Kagan, one of the great developmental researchers of the 20th century, is about to launch a study that will run for decades and quietly change how we understand personality forever. His subjects? 500 4-month-old babies. Now, if you've ever met a 4-month-old baby lately, you know it's a creature of pure, uncomplicated need. It eats, it sleeps, it cries, it poops. It mostly does not, in any obvious sense, have a personality. So when Kagan announced that he could predict, on the basis of a 45-minute observation, which of these babies were most likely to grow up to be introverts, and which were going to be extroverts, well, you can imagine the eyebrows that raised in the scientific community. But Kagan had been studying temperament for a long time, and he had a theory. So he and his team got to work. One by one, the babies were brought into the lab and exposed to a careful series of new experiences. They heard tape-recorded voices and balloons popping right beside them. They watched colorful mobiles dancing in front of their faces. They smelled cotton swabs dipped in alcohol. Simple, harmless stimuli. Nothing painful, nothing dangerous, just new. The babies reacted in wildly different ways. About 20% of them did something dramatic. They cried lustily. They flailed their tiny arms and pumped their tiny legs. They arched their backs. They were, in Kagan's words, high reactive. About 40% did the exact opposite. They lay there quietly, occasionally moving an arm or a leg, but mostly unfazed. He called them low reactive. The remaining 40% fell somewhere in the middle. Now here's where it gets interesting. Stop and think for a moment. If I told you that one group of babies cried and flailed and screamed at popping balloons, and another group lay there calmly through the whole thing, which group would you guess grew up to be the bold, social, life-of-the-party extroverts? And which group grew up to be the quiet, thoughtful introverts? Most people guess wrong. They guess that the screamers, the ones with all that energy, all that visible reaction, all that lung capacity, must be the future extroverts. And the calm ones, the placid ones, must be the future introverts. Kagan predicted the opposite. And he was right. When the babies returned to his lab at age 2, age 4, age 7, and age 11, the pattern held with eerie accuracy. The high reactive babies, the arm pumpers, the screamers, had grown into careful, serious, cautious children. They tended to think before they spoke. They had one or two close friends instead of a wide circle. They preferred quiet activities. They were, in adult terms, introverts. The low reactive babies, the calm ones, had grown into relaxed, confident, socially fluid extroverts. Kagan describes two of these children in his book, and they're so vivid that I want you to picture them. There's Tom. Tom was a high reactive baby. By 11, he's quiet, watchful, devoted to his girlfriend and his parents, prone to worry. He's brilliant in school. He loves reading. He spends hours alone working through intellectual problems. He plans to become a scientist. And then there's Ralph. Ralph was a low reactive baby. By 11, he's relaxed, self-assured, charming. He recently failed his English and science classes, not because he can't do the work, but because he was goofing off. Nothing much bothers Ralph. He admits his flaws cheerfully and moves on. Tom and Ralph, same species, same neighborhood, more or less. Completely different operating systems. So what's actually going on here? Why does a baby that hates balloons popping turn into a teenager who hates parties? What's the mechanism? The answer lives in a small almond-shaped structure deep inside your brain called the amygdala. The amygdala is part of what scientists call the limbic system, the emotional brain, the ancient part of you that you share with mice and rats and just about every other mammal. Its job is simple. It scans your environment instantly for anything new or potentially threatening. And when it finds something, a frisbee headed for your face, a snake in the path, a stranger in your kitchen, it fires off rapid signals through your nervous system that tell you to fight, freeze, or run. But here's the catch. Not everyone's amygdala is calibrated the same way. Some people are born with an amygdala that's, well, kind of jumpy, highly excitable, quick to react, slow to settle. And it turns out that the babies who flailed and screamed at popping balloons weren't extroverts in the making. They were just kids whose nervous systems were unusually sensitive to novelty. Their bodies were saying, before they had the language to even describe it, that's a lot. The mobile was a lot. The balloon was a lot. The smell of alcohol was a lot. And by the time they grew up, that same nervous system was saying, the party is a lot. The crowded restaurant is a lot. The networking event is a lot. They weren't antisocial. They weren't weak. They weren't broken. Their nervous systems were simply turned up louder than other people's. And in a world full of stimulation, that's exhausting. One of the most striking parts of Kagan's work is what happens when you measure these kids physiologically. The high reactive children had faster heart rates, more widely dilated pupils, tighter vocal cords, higher levels of the stress hormone cortisol in their saliva, even when nothing particularly stressful was happening to them. Just being in a new environment was enough to ramp up their entire body. Now take this finding and combine it with another classic experiment, one from a very different scientist. His name was Hans Eysenck, and his research was simpler and stranger than Kagan's. Async wanted to test whether introverts and extroverts actually process sensation differently, so he came up with a beautiful experiment. He put a drop of lemon juice on the tongues of adult volunteers, and he measured how much they salivated in response. You want to know what he found? The introverts salivated more, sometimes dramatically more. Their bodies were reacting more intensely to the same exact stimulus. It's a tiny experiment, almost silly if you think about it, but it's profound, because what it's really showing you is that introverts and extroverts are not running the same hardware. The introvert's nervous system is more responsive to sensory input, not just to balloons popping, not just to crowded rooms, but to taste, to sound, to light, to caffeine, to everything. The same stimulus that registers as pleasantly stimulating to an extrovert can register as overwhelming to an introvert. In another classic study, researchers had introverts and extroverts play a challenging word game while wearing headphones that emitted random bursts of noise. The participants could adjust the volume themselves to whatever level felt right. On average, the extroverts chose 72 decibels. The introverts chose 55, a noticeable difference. Then the researchers swapped them. They forced the introverts to play at the extroverts' volume and vice versa. Both groups performed worse. The introverts in particular made dramatically more errors. The noise wasn't just annoying, it was actually interfering with their ability to think. So when an introvert at your office quietly retreats to a conference room to do focused work, they're not being antisocial, they're not being difficult. Their brain is literally telling them that the open floor is too loud to think in, and the science backs them up. This changes how we should think about so many everyday experiences. The friend who needs to leave the party after 2 hours, not rude, just running hot on a different kind of fuel. The kid who freezes on the first day of school, not weak, just born with an amygdala that's screaming new at every face it sees. The coworker who needs to write up her thoughts instead of brainstorming on the spot, not slow, just trying to think clearly in a system that's been overstimulated. Now here's the part of Kagan's work that I find most beautiful. Because it might seem, from everything I've just told you, like being born high reactive is a curse. Like the universe handed you a brittle nervous system and there's nothing you can do about it. But Kagan and other researchers eventually found something they didn't expect. The high reactive kids, the ones who had been so easily overwhelmed as babies, also had an unexpected advantage. They noticed things other kids didn't. They picked up on emotional cues other kids missed. They thought more carefully before they acted. They were less likely to be impulsive, less likely to get into serious trouble, less likely to make the kinds of rash decisions that end careers and end lives. Some researchers have started calling this the orchid hypothesis. Most kids, they say, are like dandelions, hardy, adaptable, capable of growing in almost any soil. But the high reactive kids are like orchids. In harsh conditions, they wilt, they struggle, they suffer. But in the right conditions, the right family, the right teachers, the right opportunities, they don't just bloom. They become the most extraordinary flowers in the garden. The same trait that makes you fragile is the trait that makes you exceptional. The same sensitivity that overwhelms you in the wrong environment is the sensitivity that lets you see things other people miss in the right one. And once you understand that, this isn't a personality flaw to be coached out of you, but a deep biological reality that shaped you before you could even speak. Your whole relationship to your own quietness starts to shift. You stop apologizing for needing solitude. You start scheduling it. But knowing this changes more than how we think about ourselves. It changes how we think about leaders, about risk, about the kinds of people we put in charge of the most important decisions in our society. Because there's a story buried in recent history about what happens when only one kind of brain runs the show. And it's a story that cost the world trillions of dollars. Section 4. Why Wall Street Crashed and Warren Buffett Didn't. July 2007. A Citigroup executive named Chuck Prince is sitting for an interview with the Financial Times. The world's economy is teetering. The housing market is showing cracks. The smart money is starting to get nervous. And Chuck Prince, the CEO of one of the largest banks in the world, says something that will become one of the most quoted lines in the history of financial collapse. He says, "When the music stops in terms of liquidity, things will be complicated. But as long as the music is playing, you've got to get up and dance. As long as the music is playing, you've got to get up and dance." Read that sentence again in your head, because what Chuck Prince is describing, without realizing it, is not an investment strategy. It's a personality trait, a way of being in the world, a particular kind of brain making a particular kind of decision under a particular kind of pressure, and it would, in a little over a year, help blow up the global economy. Now let me tell you about another investor. Same industry, same era, same access to the same information, but a completely different kind of brain. His name is Seth Klarman. He runs a hedge fund called the Baupost Group. He is, by every account, one of the most successful investors of his generation. While most of his peers are dancing as fast as they can, Klarman is quietly worried. He keeps significant portions of his fund in cash. He hates risk. He is known among his peers, with a hint of mockery, as a world-class warrior. The New York Times once profiled him in an article called "Manager Frets Over the Market, but Still Outdoes It." He owns a racehorse, and the racehorse's name, and I love this, is Read the Footnotes. Read the footnotes. In one letter to his investors, Klarman wrote something that would sound completely insane to Chuck Prince. He wrote, "At Baupost, we are big fans of fear. In investing, it is clearly better to be scared than sorry." Big fans of fear. Now, in 2007, while everyone else was dancing, Klarman was, to use a memorable description from a colleague, probably storing cans of tuna in his basement, preparing for the end of civilization. He was an outlier, a killjoy, a man who refused to read the room. And in 2008, when the music stopped and the housing market collapsed and Lehman Brothers fell and the global financial system seized up, Seth Klarman was one of a tiny handful of investors who not only survived the crash, but thrived in it. In the 2 years that followed, while most hedge funds were hemorrhaging clients, Klarman nearly doubled his assets under management to $22 billion. How did he see what almost no one else saw? What was different about his brain? Here's what the research tells us, and it's one of the most important findings in personality psychology, because once you understand it, you'll start to see it everywhere. Introverts and extroverts process the chemistry of risk and reward differently. Specifically, extroverts have a more responsive dopamine system. Dopamine is the chemical your brain releases when you anticipate a reward, when you see an opportunity, when you spot something to chase, when the music starts and the dance floor opens up. In extroverts, this system fires hard and fast. They're more sensitive to potential rewards. They get more juice from chasing things. They're more willing to bet big, move fast, take action, and in the right context, let's be honest, this is a superpower. It's what makes great salespeople, great entrepreneurs, great founders. But here's the catch. The same wiring that helps you charge toward an opportunity can blind you to the cliff at the end of the road. Several studies have found that extroverts, on average, are more likely to ignore warning signs in pursuit of a reward, to stay at the casino longer, to take a deal that's too good to be true, to, in the language of one researcher, be punished for going for it. Their brains are wired for the dopamine of the chase, and sometimes the chase takes them off a cliff. Introverts, by contrast, have what one psychologist calls a stronger threat detection system. They're more alert to potential downsides, more attuned to what could go wrong, more likely to read the footnotes. They get less of a chemical reward from the chase and more of a chemical penalty from the consequences. So they slow down, they double check, and this is critical, they sit with discomfort instead of running from it. Most of the time, This caution looks like a personality flaw. The friend who agonizes over the menu, the colleague who asks too many questions in the meeting, the investor who keeps too much cash on the sidelines while everyone else is making a fortune. In a culture that worships speed and decisiveness, the cautious mind looks slow. It looks weak. It looks like the kind of mind we should train ourselves out of having until the music stops. There's a well-known account of the 2008 financial crisis that profiles a few of the investors who actually saw the housing collapse coming. People who not only avoided the disaster, but bet on it and made fortunes when it arrived. And the most striking thing about every one of them, every single one, is how strange they were by Wall Street standards. One of them was a doctor turned hedge fund manager named Michael Burry. Burry described himself as happy in my own head. He had a glass eye, he had Asperger's. He spent the years before the crash sitting alone in his office in San Jose, California, reading mortgage documents, not summaries, not analyst reports, the actual mortgage documents themselves. Page after page, footnote after footnote, late into the night, what he was looking for. Almost no one else was looking for. He was looking at the underlying loans being bundled into the mortgage-backed securities the entire system was built on. And what he found there shocked him. The loans were terrible. They were being given to people who could not possibly pay them back. The entire system was a house of cards, and almost no one on Wall Street had bothered to read the footnotes. Michael Burry didn't have a more sophisticated risk model than everyone else. He didn't have insider information. He didn't have a smarter analyst team. He had something rarer than any of that. He had the temperament to sit alone in a room for months, reading boring documents, until he saw what no one else could see. He had the patience to be quiet long enough to hear the music about to stop. And then there's Warren Buffett, possibly the most famous investor of all time, worth more than $100 billion, and by every account, including his own, a deep introvert. He lives in the same modest house in Omaha he bought in 1958. He eats at the same handful of restaurants. He spends, by his own description, 80% of his working day reading annual reports, newspapers, business filings, alone. His business partner Charlie Munger once said that Warren is a learning machine, not because of any genetic superpower, but because he's built a life that allows him to be quiet enough to actually think. When the rest of Wall Street is dancing, Buffett is reading. When the rest of Wall Street is panicking, Buffett is reading. When the rest of Wall Street is celebrating, Buffett is reading. His most famous quote, the one printed on 1 million coffee mugs, is, "Be fearful when others are greedy, and greedy when others are fearful." But what nobody tells you is that this is not just a clever line. It's an introvert's worldview. It's a person who by nature has been calibrated since birth to feel uneasy when everyone else feels confident, and confident when everyone else is afraid. Now I want you to think about something carefully. When we built our modern financial system, we built it largely for one kind of mind. We hire fast talkers, we promote bold movers, we reward the ones who can sell a deal, charm a client, dominate a room, the people who actually want to sit quietly and read footnotes. We tolerate them at best. We push them out at worst. We call them too cautious, too risk-averse, too slow. And then, every decade or so, the music stops, and we look around and realize we let the wrong people drive the bus. And then we promise ourselves we'll be smarter next time, and we never are. One of Klarman's colleagues said something about him that I think describes a deeper truth about a whole kind of person. He said, quote, "The same wiring that helps Seth find opportunities no one else sees can make him seem aloof or blunt. If you're the kind of person who frets every time the quarter is good, you may have trouble rising to the top of a corporate pyramid. Seth probably wouldn't have made it as a sales manager, but he is one of the great investors of our time." Read that again. He probably wouldn't have made it as a sales manager, but he is one of the great investors of our time. The system designed to identify talent on the way up would have filtered him out before he ever got the chance to show what he could actually do. How many other Seth Klarmans are sitting in corporate hierarchies right now, getting passed over for promotion because they don't dominate meetings? How many Michael Burrys are quietly being managed out of jobs because their bosses think they aren't team players? How many Warren Buffetts never become Warren Buffett because the world told them to be more outgoing, more aggressive, more like everyone else? We don't know. We will never know. But we do know this. The next financial crisis, and there will be one, is going to come from the same place every previous one has come from rooms full of confident people, all telling each other what they want to hear, drowning out the one quiet person at the table who is trying, gently, to say, wait. If you're that quiet person at your office, in your family, on your team, I want you to hear something. Your caution is not a weakness. Your slow to decide is not a flaw. Your discomfort with the noise is not a personality defect to coach out of yourself. It is, in many cases, the most valuable thing you bring to the room, and the world will be a better, safer, wiser place if you learn to trust it instead of apologizing for it. But investing isn't the only place where quiet changes the world. Sometimes, in ways far more profound than money, it changes history. Section 5. The Power of Quiet. March 9th, 1933. A New York mansion. A woman in her late 40s sits in her bedroom writing in her journal. She is, by any measure, one of the most powerful women in the world. Her husband has just been inaugurated as President of the United States in the middle of the worst economic crisis in American history. But she is also miserable, anxious, tired, lonely. Her name is Eleanor Roosevelt, and she did not want to be First Lady. Eleanor grew up shy, painfully so. Her own mother famously nicknamed her Granny because of how serious and joyless she seemed as a little girl. She was tall, gawky, awkward, sensitive to her core. Her mother died when she was 8. Her father, a charming, magnetic alcoholic, died when she was 9. She was raised by relatives, sent to a strict English boarding school, and grew up believing she was, in her own words, the ugly duckling. So how did this anxious, soft-spoken, deeply introverted woman end up married to one of the most outgoing, charming, flirtatious men in American politics? How did Eleanor Roosevelt end up with Franklin Delano Roosevelt? When they met, she was 20. He was magnetic, charismatic, the kind of man who walked into a room and changed the temperature of it. He was, and this is according to him, utterly transfixed by her depth, her seriousness, her empathy. He wrote in his journal, quote, "E is an angel." When she accepted his marriage proposal in 1903, he declared himself the happiest man alive. But the differences that drew them together started causing trouble almost immediately. Eleanor craved intimacy, quiet evenings, long, weighty conversations about ideas and people. Franklin loved parties, flirting, gossip. The man who would one day famously say he had nothing to fear but fear itself simply could not understand his wife's anxiety. As Franklin's career rose, his social calendar got louder and louder. Late nights at elite Washington clubs, parties at Harvard friends' mansions. Eleanor went home earlier and earlier, and then in 1917, while she was on summer vacation with the children in Maine, Eleanor came home, opened a suitcase her husband had left behind, and found something she was not supposed to find: a packet of love letters from her social secretary, a woman named Lucy Mercer. The affair had been going on for years. Eleanor was devastated. The marriage, in the way most people understand marriage, was effectively over. They never rekindled the romantic part of their relationship. But here's what happened next, and this is what I want you to really sit with. Because what happened next is one of the most extraordinary political partnerships in the history of the modern world. Eleanor and Franklin stayed married. They reorganized their relationship into something else something formidable. They became, in Susan Cain's beautiful phrase, a union of his confidence with her conscience. When Franklin became governor of New York and then president, he relied on Eleanor in a way no political husband had ever relied on a wife before. Because Franklin, for all his charm, all his bravado, all his political genius, couldn't actually feel what ordinary Americans were going through. He was too far away from it, too privileged, too insulated. He'd been raised in a mansion. He'd never stood in a breadline. He'd never lost a job. He couldn't, on his own, imagine the human texture of the depression he was supposed to be fixing. So Eleanor went where he couldn't. She traveled the country. She went down into coal mines. She visited tenement apartments. She talked to sharecroppers in the Deep South and unemployed factory workers in Detroit. She brought back stories, faces, names, pain, the kind of empathic intelligence that an introvert collects almost without trying, by listening more than talking, by noticing more than performing, by being the one in the room who actually sees the other people in it. And Franklin, the politician, would take her observations and turn them into policy. The New Deal, Social Security, the infrastructure of the modern American social safety net. Almost none of it would exist in the form it does without Eleanor Roosevelt walking quietly through the country, paying attention, and bringing what she saw back to a husband who had everything except the ability to feel it himself. One of his aides put it best. He said, Franklin Roosevelt was a politician, but Eleanor spoke out of conscience. He had the voice. She had the vision. Neither of them could have done it alone. And this is, I think, the deepest truth in the entire study of introversion. We've been told that quiet people are people who haven't quite become loud yet, that the introvert is just the unfinished version of the extrovert, waiting for the right training program to flip the switch. But Eleanor Roosevelt is the proof that this is exactly wrong. She didn't change the world in spite of her quietness. She changed the world because of it. Now let me take you to another century, another continent, another quiet person who reshaped history. India, the late 1800s. A small, frail boy named Mohandas is growing up terrified of almost everything. He's afraid of thieves. He's afraid of ghosts. He's afraid of snakes. He's afraid of the dark. Most of all, he's afraid of other people. He runs home from school as soon as the bell rings, because the thought of having to talk to another human being is unbearable to him. He buries himself in books. He prefers his own company to anyone else's. Years later, as a young man, he is elected to his very first leadership position, a committee of the Vegetarian Society in London. He attends every single meeting, and in his own words, he is, quote, too shy to speak. Not once. Not at any meeting. Another member, baffled, asks him, "You talk to me quite all right, but why is it that you never open your lips at a committee meeting? You are a drone." When a political struggle broke out on that very committee, a struggle Gandhi had strong opinions about, he was so paralyzed by his shyness that he could not bring himself to speak. He wrote his thoughts down on paper, intending to read them aloud at the next meeting. But in the end, he couldn't even do that. This is the man who would one day bring the British Empire to its knees. So how did Mohandas Gandhi, the terrified boy who couldn't talk in a vegetarian society meeting, become Mahatma Gandhi, the most influential non-violent revolutionary in human history? Here's what's remarkable. He didn't really become someone else. He didn't take a Tony Robbins seminar. He didn't fake it till he made it. He didn't transform himself into an extrovert. He simply learned over time to use his shyness as a tool rather than experience it as a curse. As a young man, Gandhi decided to travel to England to study law. His subcaste, the Modi Banya, forbade it. They believed vegetarianism would be impossible in England and that meat-eating would be inevitable. Gandhi had already vowed to his mother to remain vegetarian, so he believed there was no danger. He told the headmen of the community he was going. The community excommunicated him, stripped him out. Even when he returned years later as a successful English-speaking lawyer, the judgment held. He was not allowed to eat or drink in the homes of his own subcaste members, not at his sister's house, not at his mother-in-law's house. He was, for all practical purposes, cast out. Now think about what most people would do. Most people would fight, argue, petition, build a coalition, apply pressure, demand readmission. Gandhi did the opposite. He accepted the ruling completely. He did not push. He did not argue. He did not even allow his sister and his in-laws to host him secretly when they offered to. He simply, quietly, stepped back. And here is what happened. The subcaste members, including the very people who had cast him out, eventually softened toward him. They came to him. They helped him in his political work, without ever expecting anything in return. They treated him with affection and generosity. Gandhi wrote later, and I want to read his exact words because they are so important. Had I agitated for being admitted to the caste, had I attempted to divide it into more camps, had I provoked the castemen, they would surely have retaliated. Instead of steering clear of the storm, I should have found myself in a whirlpool of agitation. He chose not to fight, and he won. This pattern, the strategic refusal to engage in unnecessary battle, would become the defining principle of his entire political life. As a young lawyer in South Africa, when he was applying for admission to the local bar, the Chief Justice ordered him to remove his turban as a sign of submission. Gandhi could have refused. His friends urged him to refuse. They told him he was being weak, but Gandhi took off the turban. He wrote later that he had, quote, learned to appreciate the beauty of compromise. He coined a word for what he was doing. The word was satyagraha. We usually translate it as passive resistance, but Gandhi himself rejected that translation because there was nothing passive about it. He preferred firmness in pursuit of truth, the willingness to absorb force without returning it, the discipline to know which battles to fight and which to walk past. And here is the line from Gandhi's autobiography that I have not been able to stop thinking about since I first read it. He wrote, and I want you to hear this carefully, "My shyness has been in reality my shield and my buckler. It has allowed me to grow. It has helped me in my discernment of truth. My shyness has been my shield, the thing the world told him to fix, the thing his classmates had mocked, the thing he had himself as a young man been ashamed of. That thing turned out to be the source of his strength, not the weakness he had to overcome to become great, the very thing that made him great in the first place." Let me give you one more example, this one from our own time. A modern American introvert who almost gave up on his own message until he found the right way to deliver it. 1968, Harvard University. A young undergraduate is sitting in a classroom listening to an oceanographer present some of the earliest evidence linking the burning of fossil fuels to the warming of the planet. The undergraduate's ears perk up. He feels something click in his brain. He realizes in that moment that this is the most important problem he has ever heard of. The student's name is Gore, and for the next 40 years, he will try, mostly without success, to make Congress care. Gore is by every account a deep introvert. One of his former aides said, "If you send an introvert into a reception of 100 people, he will come out with less energy than he went in. Al needs to rest after an event." Gore himself has said, "Most people in politics draw energy from backslapping and shaking hands. I draw energy from discussing ideas." In the middle of the 1970s, Gore, by then a member of Congress, helped organize the first ever congressional hearings on global warming. He genuinely believed, naively believed, that once he laid out the evidence, his colleagues would be alarmed, that the science would speak for itself, that Congress would act, and of course, nothing happened. The Ralphs of the world, as Jerome Kagan would have called them, were too busy with the next political fight, the next photo opportunity, the next handshake, to feel any urgency about a slow-moving catastrophe they couldn't yet see. Gore spent decades trying to get them to listen, and he failed. He gave speeches that fell flat. He campaigned for president and lost the most disputed election in modern American history. He left politics, by his own description, defeated and exhausted. And then, in his 50s, he did something that introverts often do when the world refuses to hear them. He stopped trying to talk like the loudest people in the room. He went back to his sweet spot. He sat down, he read, he researched, he wrote. And eventually, with the help of filmmakers who knew how to translate his quiet intensity into something an audience could feel, he made a documentary called An Inconvenient Truth. The movie won an Oscar. Gore won a Nobel Peace Prize. And almost single-handedly, he turned climate change from a fringe scientific concern into one of the defining global conversations of the 21st century. But notice how he did it. He didn't become more charismatic. He didn't transform into a backslapping politician. He stopped trying to win the room and instead used what he was naturally good at: deep research, single-minded focus, patient assembly of evidence, to build something that could speak for him. The film was his shield and buckler, just like Gandhi's shyness, just like Eleanor Roosevelt's empathy, just like Wozniak's solitude. Each of these people changed the world. None of them did it by becoming extroverts. Each of them did it by finding the format that let their natural way of being do its work. So if you've ever felt like your quiet way of moving through the world is somehow inadequate to the size of the dreams you carry, I want you to remember Eleanor walking quietly through coal mines and bringing back the depression to a husband who couldn't feel it. Remember Gandhi taking off his turban and winning his case. Remember Al Gore quietly assembling 40 years of evidence and finally putting it on a movie screen. Your shyness might not be a weakness. It might be the shield that lets you do the most important thing you will ever do. But knowing this is one thing. Actually living it, actually building a life that lets your quiet strength do its work, is another. And that's the practical question we haven't answered yet. How do you live like an introvert in a world that keeps asking you to be someone else? Section 6. How to live like an introvert in an extrovert's world. Imagine, for a moment, two completely different men. The first one is a Harvard University psychology lecturer. Short, sturdy, bespectacled, a booming baritone voice. He breaks into song in the middle of lectures. He twirls across the stage. He has a habit of emphasizing his consonants, like an old-school Shakespearean actor. People have described him as a cross between Robin Williams and Albert Einstein. His classes are so popular that students sit on the floor in the aisles. They give him standing ovations. 3M, the company, awarded him a teaching fellowship, sometimes called the Nobel Prize of College Teaching. Now picture a second man in a completely different setting. He lives in a tucked-away house on more than 2 acres of remote Canadian woods. He spends most of his time alone. He scores music. He reads. He writes long, thoughtful emails to friends he calls epistles. At parties, he tries to find one person to have a quiet conversation with as soon as he arrives. When he's forced to be too social for too long, he can literally, and this is not a figure of speech, make himself physically ill. Would you be surprised to learn that the lively, beloved Harvard lecturer and the reclusive Canadian woodsman are the same man? They are. His name is Brian Little. He is a true, deep off-the-charts introvert who has spent decades pretending to be an extrovert for 2 hours at a time in front of his classes, and then quietly disappearing back into his woods to recover. And the question Brian Little has spent his career trying to answer is the question I want to ask you right now. Can a person be one thing on the outside and something else entirely on the inside? Can an introvert play the role of an extrovert without losing themselves? And if the answer is yes, what's the cost? Little eventually developed a theory to explain what he was doing in those Harvard classrooms. He called it free trait theory, and it goes something like this. Yes, we are born with a fixed temperament. Yes, the rubber band of your personality can only stretch so far before it snaps back. But within those limits, All of us are capable of acting out of character for the things that matter most to us. Little calls these things our core personal projects. A core personal project is anything you care about deeply enough that you're willing to suffer for it. For Brian Little, it was teaching. He genuinely, profoundly loved igniting his students' minds. So twice a week he would put on the persona of the bombastic professor and pour every ounce of his energy into them, knowing the entire time that the bill was going to come due. Free trait theory explains why a quiet librarian might force herself to deliver a passionate speech at her best friend's wedding, why a soft-spoken accountant might learn to give compelling presentations to save his small business, why a deeply introverted father might suddenly become animated and silly at his daughter's birthday party. They're acting out of character, but they're doing it for something they love. But, and this is the part that almost no one tells you, there is a price. Brian Little tells this story about himself. He says that at Harvard, after teaching a particularly intense class, he would sometimes need to hide in the men's bathroom afterward, not because anything had gone wrong, but because he could not handle one more conversation. Not even a polite, great class professor in the hallway. He would lock himself in a stall, breathe slowly, and wait for the wave of overstimulation to pass. Once, before he had this routine figured out, a colleague caught him in the bathroom in genuine distress. The colleague was understandably worried. Was Brian okay? Brian, who was a deeply private and deeply polite man, eventually came up with a system. After class, he would head straight to the bathroom, lock himself in a stall, and lift his feet up onto the toilet seat so no one could see them under the door. He hid from his own students by pretending to be a phantom in a bathroom stall. The most beloved lecturer at Harvard, and here I think is one of the most important insights this entire field of research has produced. Acting out of character is real. It works. Introverts can be powerful public speakers. They can lead meetings, they can charm clients, they can throw birthday parties for their children, but they cannot do it without a cost, and the cost has to be paid back, in private, in the form of solitude. Brian Little has a name for this too. He calls it a restorative niche, a place, physical or mental, where you go to refill the energy you spent acting out of character. For Brian, it was that bathroom stall. For others, it might be a long walk after work, a locked office, a bath, a bedroom, a drive home with no radio on. The single most important thing you can do for yourself, if you're an introvert living in a world that demands extroversion from you, is to build restorative niches into your life on purpose, not as a reward when you finally have time, as a requirement, the way you'd schedule meals, the way an athlete schedules rest days. Otherwise, and Brian Little is very clear about this, you will burn out, you will become resentful, you will become physically ill, you will start to dread your own life. The same way an extrovert who is forced into solitary confinement starts to lose their mind, an introvert who is forced into permanent performance starts to lose theirs. We are not designed for this. None of us are. But here is where it gets interesting, and where the practical part of all this really takes shape. Because once you understand restorative niches, you can stop apologizing for them. You can stop calling them selfish. You can start treating them as essential infrastructure. I want to tell you about a couple now. We'll call them Greg and Emily. They've been together for years. They love each other deeply. And one Friday night a month, they have the same fight. Greg loves Friday nights. Friday night is when he comes alive. He's the extrovert in the relationship. He'd love to host a dinner party every single Friday, 6 friends around the table, music playing, wine flowing, ideas flying. To Greg, this is the entire point of being married. You build a life together. You fill it with people. You celebrate. Emily is the introvert. She has spent the entire work week being on at her job. By the time Friday night arrives, she is empty. The thought of hosting 6 people, the cooking, the cleaning, the listening, the laughing on cue, the staying present through a 4-hour dinner, feels less like a celebration and more like a tax bill she didn't ask for. So every Friday, Greg suggests inviting friends over. Emily resists. Greg feels rejected. He says, "You don't want to be married to me." Emily feels accused. She says, "You don't understand how exhausted I am." They go in circles. Neither of them is wrong. Neither of them is being unreasonable. They simply have different operating systems trying to run the same shared schedule. And the way most couples like Greg and Emily eventually solve this, once they understand the science behind their differences, is that they stop arguing about who is right and start negotiating about what's possible. They might compromise on one dinner party a month instead of every week. Emily might agree to host, but with the explicit understanding that she gets all of Saturday to recover alone. Greg might learn to go out with his friends on his own some Fridays, instead of dragging Emily along to events she dreads. They build a shared life that has room for both of their nervous systems. And here's the deepest reframe of all. Greg has to stop interpreting Emily's need for solitude as a rejection of him. She is not pulling away from him when she goes quiet. She is recharging so that the version of her that returns to him is actually present, actually warm, actually alive. The solitude is not the opposite of love. The solitude is what makes the love sustainable. Most introvert-extrovert couples with this understanding end up with stronger marriages than couples who are similar in temperament, because they learn to see something in each other that the other can't always see in themselves. Greg helps Emily get out into the world. Emily helps Greg rest in it. Each of them, by stretching toward the other, becomes more whole. But the place where this is hardest and where the stakes are highest is not in the office or in the marriage. It's in the classroom, with our children, the youngest, most vulnerable introverts among us. I want you to meet a 5th grader. Her name is Maya. She has a red ponytail, wire-rimmed glasses, a dreamy, faraway expression that she carries everywhere. She loves to read. She's bright, observant, kind, and on a Tuesday morning in October, in her brightly lit New York City classroom, she is being slowly crushed. The lesson is on the 3 branches of American government. The teacher has divided the class into 3 groups of 7 kids each. Maya's group is the executive branch. They have to come up with a system to enforce a new classroom cleanliness rule. The kids in the group are all talking at once. A girl named Samantha pulls a sandwich bag out of her backpack and announces, "Whoever's holding the bag gets to talk." The bag starts circulating. When it reaches Maya, she looks overwhelmed. "I agree," she says, and passes the bag like a hot potato to the next person. The bag circles the table several times. Each time, Maya hands it on without speaking. Finally, she works up the courage to try. "Wait, I have an idea," Samantha sighs. "Go ahead." But the sharpness in her voice, the impatience that Maya, like many sensitive introverts, is exquisitely attuned to, makes Maya falter. She opens her mouth. She lowers her eyes. Whatever brilliant idea she had a second ago dies in her throat. She mumbles something unintelligible. The cool girl in the group sighs theatrically and says, "Okay, Samantha, you can keep reading the rules now." Maya peters out into silence. The teacher comes back at the end of the exercise and asks the executive branch for a report. Samantha presents the entire group's work. Everyone gets credit. Maya, who has thoughts and opinions and ideas she could not deliver in the available format, gets a participation score that quietly suggests she did not contribute. This is happening in classrooms all over the world right now as you listen to this, to children who are not failing, to children who are quietly being failed. So what do we do? If you are a parent or a teacher or an aunt or someone who simply cares about the quiet kids in your life, what do you actually do? The first thing is to stop trying to fix them. Stop using the word shy as if it were a problem to be solved. Stop apologizing for them at the playground. Stop saying she's a little shy the way you'd say she has a cold, like it's a temporary illness she'll get over. Because children believe what we say about them, And if a child grows up hearing that her quietness is a defect, she will spend her entire adulthood trying to hide the deepest part of who she is. Instead, give her the words for what she actually is. Tell her she's a thinker, a noticer, a careful person. Tell her some people warm up faster, and some people warm up slower, and both are completely okay. Tell her that being slow to speak does not mean you have nothing to say. Tell her that sometimes the people who are paying the most attention are the ones who say the least. And then, and this is critical, protect her right to recover. Build solitude into her schedule. If she needs to come home from school and read in her room for an hour before doing homework, let her. That is not laziness. That is her amygdala bringing itself back down to ground level after a 6-hour assault of fluorescent lights and group projects and forced cheerfulness. She is not avoiding life. She is making it survivable. Help her find 1 or 2 deep passions. Researchers have found over and over again that what truly builds confidence in an introverted child is not popularity. It is not making her go to more birthday parties. It is mastery. Real, deep, hard-won mastery of something she loves. I want to tell you one last story before we move toward our close. A man named David Weiss. David is a drummer and a music journalist. As an adult, he is a happy, successful, deeply connected human being. He lives in New York City. He loves his wife. He loves his work. He has a wide circle of fascinating friends. By every measure that matters, his life works. But as a kid, David was miserable, painfully shy. He felt like a misfit in his suburban Detroit middle school. He looked, in his words, like he had stepped right out of the cast of Revenge of the Nerds. People kept telling him these were the best years of his life, and he would think, please God, I hope not. What changed everything? One thing. David started playing the drums. At first, it was just for the social cover. Drumming made him cool enough to stop getting kicked out of parties. But quickly, it became something deeper. It became his identity. It became his discipline. It became the thing he was unmistakably, undeniably good at. And once a child has one of those things, one true mastery, one real source of competence, everything else gets easier. The teasing matters less. The lunchroom matters less. The school day becomes survivable because there is something on the other side of it. As an adult, David says something I haven't been able to stop thinking about. He says, whenever I'm doing something now that I think is cool, like interviewing Alicia Keys in a Manhattan studio, I send a message back to my 9-year-old self. I tell him that everything turned out okay, and I feel like when I was 9, I was already receiving that signal, somehow knowing the future. That's part of what gave me the strength to hang in there. If you are quiet and young and listening to this, that message is for you too. If you are the parent of a quiet child, your job is to make sure that message gets through. So we've covered a lot: the biology, the history, the science, the strategies. Let me pull it all together now and tell you what, practically, today, this week, you can actually do with all of this. Key takeaways. First, stop trying to fix yourself. If you are an introvert, you are not a broken extrovert. You are not a half-finished person waiting to be completed by the right seminar. You are running a different operating system. It is just as valid as the other one. It is, in many important contexts, the superior one. The single most life-changing thing you can do is to stop apologizing for who you are and start designing a life that fits you. Second, protect your sweet spot. Every nervous system has an optimal level of stimulation. For introverts, that level is lower than the modern world's default setting. Find your version of Wozniak's pre-dawn cubicle, the quiet hour, the locked door, the morning walk. Build your work, your hobbies, your social life around the conditions in which your mind actually thrives. The world will reward you for the work you do best, and you cannot do your best work in an environment that's screaming at you. Third, use free trade theory wisely. You can stretch beyond your temperament when something you love demands it. The wedding speech, the job interview, the presentation, the first day with a new client. Stretch for those things, but pay the bill afterward. Build restorative niches into your life on purpose, not by accident. Schedule recovery the way an athlete schedules rest. Do not pretend you don't need it. Fourth, trust your caution. The same part of your brain that makes parties exhausting is the part that makes you a better risk assessor than 90% of the people around you. When everyone in the room is sure and your gut is whispering, wait, that whisper is information. Honor it. The world's worst financial decisions, its worst political decisions, its worst medical decisions almost all come from rooms full of confident people, drowning out the quiet voice that was trying to slow them down. Fifth, if you love an introvert, give them their solitude without making it mean something it doesn't. They are not pulling away from you. They are recharging so they can return to you. The space they need is the price of the depth they offer. And if you love an extrovert, accept that their need for stimulation is just as real as your need for quiet, and meet them in the middle. Sixth, if you are raising a quiet child, your job is to protect their pace. Do not pathologize their shyness. Do not push them into permanent performance. Help them find 1 or 2 passions they can master. Let them recover after school. Tell them over and over that the world has room for who they actually are. Because if you don't tell them, the world won't. And seventh, this last one matters more than people realize. If you are an introvert in a position of any kind of power, a manager, a teacher, a parent, a leader of any group, even a group of 2, make space for the quiet voices in your room. Do not mistake volume for value. Do not mistake confidence for correctness. Do not mistake speed for intelligence. The most important idea in the next meeting you sit in is probably about to come from the quietest person at the table. Make sure they have a way to share it, because if they don't, they won't. So, where does all of this leave us? Closing. Let's go back to the bus. Montgomery, Alabama, December 1st, 1955. A soft-spoken seamstress refuses to give up her seat. A police officer asks her, almost confused, "Why do you all push us around?" And she answers him in a quiet voice with what might be the most powerful single word in 20th century American history: no. Rosa Parks did not stand up and give a speech. She did not raise her fist. She did not orate. She did what introverts have done throughout history. She sat very still, in her own quiet authority, and refused to be moved. And from that single quiet act, a movement was born, one that would, eventually, change the moral arc of an entire nation. After she died, her obituaries called her, again and again, timid and shy. But they also said she had, quote, the courage of a lion. And that is the puzzle this entire video has been about. How can someone be timid and have the courage of a lion? How can shyness become a shield and a buckler, as Gandhi said? How can the quiet ones, again and again, end up being the ones who change the world? The answer, I think, is that we have been measuring greatness with the wrong instrument. We mistook volume for strength. We mistook charisma for substance. We mistook the loudest voices for the wisest ones. And while we were busy applauding the dancers, the quiet people in the back of the room were inventing the future, writing the books, raising the children, building the empires, sitting on the buses, and quietly, patiently, deliberately changing everything. If you are quiet, really deeply quiet, the way Wozniak and Eleanor and Gandhi and Rosa Parks were quiet, I want you to hear something. The world does not need you to become someone else. The world is waiting on the work that only you can do, in the way only you can do it. Your quietness is not a tax on your potential. It is the location of your potential. So I want to leave you with a question. Not the easy question, are you an introvert or an extrovert? That's not the interesting question. The interesting question is this: what is the work you would do? What is the person you would be? What is the life you would build if you stopped trying to be louder than you actually are and instead used everything you already have. Susan Cain ends her book by reminding us of something I hadn't really thought about before. The man who created one of the most beloved children's stories in the English language, Alice in Wonderland, was a man named Lewis Carroll, soft-spoken, painfully shy, deeply private, the kind of man who would never have been picked first for anything. And he wrote a story about a quiet little girl who falls down a hole into a world no one else can see and turns it into something fresh and fantastic and entirely her own. Without Lewis Carroll, there is no Wonderland. And by now, this shouldn't surprise us. The secret to a meaningful life, Susan Cain writes, is to put yourself in the right lighting. For some people, that lighting is a Broadway spotlight. For others, it's a lamp on a quiet desk in a quiet room. Both kinds of light are beautiful. Both kinds of light let you see. The only mistake is trying to live under the wrong one. If this video helped you see yourself or someone you love in a new way, I'd love to know in the comments, what's the one thing you've been told was a weakness that you're now starting to suspect might actually be a strength? I read every comment, and I think this one might turn into one of the most meaningful threads we've had on this channel. If you want to go deeper, Susan Cain's book, Quiet, is a genuinely beautiful piece of work. It's available on Amazon and Audible. Links are in the description. The audiobook in particular is excellent if you, like a lot of us, do your best listening on long walks alone. And if you found something here that moved you, hit subscribe. There are a lot of books like this one, books that quietly change how you see yourself, and we cover one of them every week. Until next time, thanks for listening. And remember, the secret is to put yourself in the right lighting.